The cracks in my marriage weren't sudden, but rather a slow, creeping erosion of something I thought was solid. It started with the little things: my husband forgetting our anniversary, brushing off my attempts to talk about our future, and spending more time with his phone than he ever did with me. At first, I excused it. He was busy with work, I told myself, stressed about deadlines and office politics. But as the weeks turned into months, I couldn't ignore the growing distance between us. The man I once shared everything with had become a stranger in his own home. One night, after another dinner eaten in silence, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from me. The ache in my chest was unbearable. I wasn't sure if it was loneliness or frustration, but I knew I couldn't continue living like this. When I confided in my best friend Rachel, she suggested therapy. "Sometimes you just need a third party to help you communicate," she said, her voice soft but insistent. "It doesn't mean you're failing, it just means you're trying." I hesitated. Therapy felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that my marriage was truly broken. But deep down, I knew she was right. Something had to change. And if my husband and I couldn't fix it ourselves, maybe someone else could help us bridge the gap. When I brought it up to him, his reaction was lukewarm at best. "Therapy? Do we really need that?" he asked, his tone laced with skepticism. "I mean, we're fine, aren't we?" "Are we?" I shot back, unable to hide the bitterness in my voice. "Because it doesn't feel fine to me." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "If it's that important to you, I'll go. But I don't think we need it." His indifference stung, but at least he agreed. I clung to that small victory as we scheduled our first session. Walking into Dr. Evan Reed's office for the first time, I felt a mix of nerves and hope. The room was warm and inviting, with soft lighting and shelves lined with books. Dr. Reed himself exuded a calm authority that immediately put me at ease. He was in his early 40s, with neatly styled dark hair and kind, piercing blue eyes that seemed to look straight through me. His voice was steady and soothing, and as he introduced himself, I found myself relaxing for the first time in weeks. Our first session was awkward, as I expected it to be. My husband sat stiffly beside me, arms crossed as if he were preparing for a courtroom interrogation rather than a conversation. I stumbled through my words, trying to articulate the dissatisfaction and hurt that had been building inside me for months. Dr. Reed listened intently, nodding occasionally, but never interrupting. When it was my husband's turn to speak, his responses were curt and defensive. "I don't know what she wants from me," he said at one point, his tone exasperated. "I work hard, I provide for our family. Isn't that enough?" "It's not about money or stability," I interjected, my voice cracking. "I need more than that. I need connection." Dr. Reed gently stepped in, guiding the conversation with a series of probing yet non-judgmental questions. He had a way of reframing our arguments, helping us see each other's perspectives in a way we hadn't before. By the end of the session, I felt a glimmer of hope, even if my husband still seemed unconvinced. Over the next few weeks, we attended therapy regularly. Each session was a mix of breakthroughs and setbacks, moments of clarity interspersed with heated disagreements. Dr. Reed was a steady presence throughout, skillfully navigating the tension and helping us unpack layers of resentment and miscommunication. But something unexpected began to happen. While my husband remained distant and detached, I found myself looking forward to our sessions, not because I thought they were saving our marriage, but because of Dr. Reed. There was something about him that drew me in, a quiet intensity that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just his professionalism or his empathy, it was the way he remembered the smallest details about me, the way his eyes softened when I spoke about my struggles, and the way he encouraged me to rediscover my own voice. For the first time in a long time, I felt valued, not as a wife or a caretaker, but as an individual. One session, when my husband was particularly irritable, Dr. Reed shifted his focus to me. "How are you holding up through all of this?" he asked, his gaze locking onto mine. I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I'm trying," I said finally, "but it's hard. I feel like I'm the only one fighting for this marriage." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's clear that you've been carrying a lot on your shoulders. Sometimes, when one person feels like they're doing all the work, it's easy to lose sight of your own needs. Have you taken any time for yourself lately? To recharge, to reflect?" The question caught me off guard. Time for myself? The idea felt almost foreign. My days were consumed by work, household responsibilities, and trying to keep my marriage afloat. I couldn't remember the last time I did something purely for me. "No," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I guess I haven't." Dr. Reed's eyes softened even further. "You deserve to take care of yourself too. It's not selfish. It's necessary. You can't pour from an empty cup." His words lingered with me long after the session ended. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I replayed the conversation in my mind. There was something about the way he said it, the genuine concern in his voice, that stirred something inside me. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of hope, not just for my marriage, but for myself. By the end of the month, the dynamic between my husband and me hadn't changed much. If anything, therapy seemed to highlight our differences rather than resolve them. But my sessions with Dr. Reed became a lifeline, a space where I could express myself without fear of judgment or dismissal. And then, one evening, as I was leaving his office, Dr. Reed said something that stopped me in my tracks. "You've made a lot of progress," he said, his tone warm. "It's inspiring to see how much effort you're putting into this process." "Thank you," I replied, caught off guard by the compliment. He hesitated, as if debating whether to say more. Finally, he added, "I hope you know that you're stronger than you think." The words were simple, but the way he said them, his voice low and sincere, made my heart skip a beat. For a fleeting moment, our eyes met, and I felt something shift. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A spark, a connection, something that both thrilled and terrified me. I quickly looked away, mumbling a polite goodbye as I hurried out the door, but as I walked to my car, my heart racing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Therapy was meant to be a bridge between my husband and me, a way to reconnect and rebuild what had crumbled. But week by week, it began to feel like a bridge to something else entirely, something unexpected, something forbidden. At first, I dismissed it as gratitude. Dr. Reed was kind, patient, and attentive, qualities I had long stopped associating with the man I married. It felt good to be heard, to have someone take my feelings seriously without brushing them aside. But gratitude started to morph into something more complicated. I found myself looking forward to our sessions not for the progress we were making as a couple, but for the moments when Dr. Reed would ask me about myself. Just me. One evening, after a particularly frustrating session, I stayed behind to speak with Dr. Reed privately. My husband had left in a huff after yet another argument, muttering something about wasting time and money. I stood in the doorway, torn between following him and staying. Do you have a minute? I asked, my voice hesitant. Dr. Reed looked up from his notes, his expression calm and open. Of course. Come in. I closed the door softly behind me and sat back down on the couch. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The room felt heavier without my husband's presence, as if the air itself were holding its breath. I don't know if this is working, I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes it feels like we're just going through the motions, like he doesn't even want to try. Dr. Reed leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. It's natural to feel that way when progress seems slow, but from what I've observed, you're putting in a lot of effort. That's not nothing. I shook my head, frustration bubbling to the surface. It doesn't matter if it's one-sided. I can't fix this marriage on my own. He was quiet for a moment, letting my words settle. You're right, he said finally. It takes two people to rebuild a relationship, but it's also important to recognize your own worth in this process. You're more than just your role as a wife. His words hit me harder than I expected. I felt a lump rise in my throat, and I quickly looked down, hoping he wouldn't notice the tears welling in my eyes. I don't know who I am outside of that role anymore, I admitted, my voice trembling. It's like I've spent so much time trying to hold everything together that I lost myself in the process. Dr. Reed's expression softened, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. Empathy, maybe, or understanding. It's not uncommon to feel that way, he said gently, but it's never too late to rediscover yourself. Over the next few weeks, my individual moments with Dr. Reed became the highlights of our sessions. It wasn't that he ignored my husband. Far from it. He continued to guide us as a couple, offering practical advice and strategies to improve our communication. But there were moments when it felt like the room shrank, leaving just the two of us in a bubble of understanding. One day, after an especially tense session, I lingered in the waiting room, gathering my thoughts before heading home. Dr. Reed stepped out of his office, a stack of papers in hand, and paused when he saw me.
"Everything okay?" he asked, his voice low and concerned.
I nodded, forcing a smile. Yeah, just needed a moment. He hesitated, then stepped closer. If you ever need to talk outside of our sessions, you can always reach out. I'm here to support you. There it was again, that flicker of something in his eyes, something that made my pulse quicken. I thanked him and left, my thoughts spinning. Was I imagining things? Or was there really something unspoken, lingering between us? It wasn't until I saw him outside the context of therapy that I realized how deeply he had worked his way into my thoughts. I was at a local cafe one rainy afternoon, trying to lose myself in a book, when I looked up and saw him standing in line. He hadn't noticed me yet, and for a moment I considered slipping out unnoticed. But before I could act, his eyes met mine. He smiled. A warm, genuine smile that made my heart skip a beat. "Fancy meeting you here," he said, walking over to my table. I laughed nervously, closing my book. Small town, I guess. He gestured to the empty chair across from me. "Mind if I join you?" I hesitated, knowing it was probably a bad idea, but before I could stop myself, I nodded. "Sure." We talked for what felt like hours, though it was probably no more than 20 minutes. The conversation was light at first, books, movies, the weather. But there was an undercurrent of tension I couldn't ignore. When he mentioned his own struggles with balancing work and personal life, I saw a vulnerability in him that made him feel less like my therapist and more like something else. That night, as I lay in bed beside my husband, I couldn't stop thinking about Dr. Reed. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me, the way he seemed to truly see me. It was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. I tried to push the thoughts away, telling myself it was just a harmless crush, a reaction to the emotional void in my marriage. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I wasn't just drawn to him, I was yearning for him, for the way he made me feel alive again. The next time we were in his office, I found it harder to meet his eyes. Every time he spoke, my mind wandered back to that cafe, to the way he looked at me when it was just the two of us. I wondered if he felt it too, this unspoken tension that seemed to fill the room whenever we were alone. At the end of the session, as I gathered my things, he hesitated before speaking. "Take care of yourself," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You deserve to be happy." There was nothing overtly inappropriate about his words, but the way he said them, the way his eyes lingered on mine, sent a shiver down my spine. I left his office that day feeling more conflicted than ever. The cracks in my marriage were growing wider, and for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to fix them. The connection I had with Dr. Reed felt like a lifeline, pulling me out of the suffocating darkness of my unhappiness. But it also felt dangerous, like a fire that could consume everything if I let it. I told myself I could handle it, that I could keep my feelings in check, but deep down I knew I was already standing on the edge of something I might not be able to walk away from. The air between us had changed. I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment it shifted, but I felt it in every glance, every word exchanged in his office. It was a subtle but undeniable current pulling me closer to Dr. Reed. I told myself it was all in my head, a manifestation of my own longing for connection. But the truth was harder to ignore with each passing session. It started innocently enough, or at least that's how I justified it. The lingering moments at the end of our sessions when he would look at me as though he wanted to say something more. The way his voice would soften when he spoke directly to me, as though we were the only two people in the room. The thrill I felt when his gaze lingered just a second too long. One evening, after a particularly revealing session, my husband left early, slamming the door behind him. His frustration had become routine by now. I stayed behind, needing a moment to collect myself before facing the tense atmosphere at home. Dr. Reed remained seated across from me, his usual professional demeanor replaced with a quiet concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and soothing. I nodded, though my eyes betrayed me. "I'm fine," I lied. "I just need a minute." He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on his knees. "It's okay to not be fine," he said gently. "You don't always have to hold it all together." Something in his words broke through the wall I'd been holding up. Tears welled in my eyes, and before I could stop myself, they spilled over. I quickly wiped them away, embarrassed by my vulnerability. "I'm sorry," I whispered, avoiding his gaze. "I don't mean to." "Don't apologize," he interrupted, his voice firm but kind. "You're allowed to feel this way." I finally looked up at him, and the warmth in his eyes was almost too much to bear. For a moment, we just sat there in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air between us. I felt exposed, but also seen, truly seen. The first physical boundary was crossed on a rainy evening. I was rushing into the building, fumbling with my umbrella, when he appeared out of nowhere, holding the door open for me. I was startled to see him outside the usual context of his office. "Thanks," I said, slightly out of breath. "You're welcome," he replied, his smile disarming. "Rough day?" I nodded, not trusting myself to elaborate. He held the door a moment longer than necessary, his hand brushing against mine as I passed. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a shiver down my spine. Inside the elevator, the tension was palpable. The enclosed space magnified every stolen glance, every unspoken thought. I could feel his presence beside me, solid and grounding, yet charged with something electric. When the elevator doors opened, we both hesitated, as though neither of us wanted to break the spell. The moments between us began to build, each one more significant than the last. During a session, he asked me a question that caught me off guard. "If you could change one thing about your life right now, what would it be?" The answer should have been obvious, my marriage, but the words that came to my mind weren't about my husband. They were about myself, about him. I don't know," I stammered, feeling the weight of his gaze on me. He nodded slowly, as though he understood the words I couldn't say. "Sometimes the hardest part is admitting what you really want." His words hung in the air, and I felt my heartbeat quicken. Did he know? Could he see through me so completely? Or was I just projecting my own desires onto him? The turning point came during an evening session. My husband had canceled at the last minute, leaving me alone with Dr. Reed for the entire hour. The room felt different without my husband's presence, less tense, more intimate. I could feel the walls between us thinning with every word spoken. As the session wound down, I found myself lingering, reluctant to leave. Dr. Reed seemed to sense my hesitation, and instead of rushing me out, he sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You seem distracted," he said, his tone careful. I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "It's just been a lot lately," I said finally. "Sometimes I feel like I'm losing myself." "You're not," he said firmly. "You're rediscovering yourself. That's not the same thing." The words were like a lifeline, pulling me out of the fog of self-doubt I'd been living in. For a moment, I felt an overwhelming urge to close the distance between us, to reach out and touch him, to see if the connection I felt was real. But I held back, afraid of crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. That line was finally crossed on a rainy Thursday evening. I had stayed behind after another session, unable to bring myself to leave. Dr. Reed was packing up his notes when he noticed me still sitting there. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. I nodded, though my eyes betrayed me. I don't want to go home right now." He paused, setting his papers down. "You don't have to explain," he said softly. "Sometimes it's okay to take a moment for yourself." His words were like a balm to my frayed nerves. I looked up at him, and for the first time, I let myself truly see him, not as my therapist, but as a man. The kindness in his eyes, the strength in his posture, the way he made me feel safe yet vulnerable all at once. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're doing the best you can," he replied, stepping closer. "That's all anyone can ask of you." The air between us felt charged, electric. I could feel the pull, the invisible thread drawing us closer together. And then, before I could second guess myself, I reached out, my hand brushing against his. He froze for a moment, his eyes searching mine. "This is complicated," he said finally, his voice low. "I know," I whispered, "but it doesn't change how I feel." For a moment I thought he might pull away, but instead he closed the distance between us, his hand covering mine. The touch was gentle, hesitant, but it ignited something in me that I couldn't ignore. Neither of us said a word, but the silence spoke volumes. We both knew we had crossed a line, one that couldn't be undone. But in that moment, I didn't care. For the first time in years, I felt alive. Crossing the line should have been terrifying, but instead, it felt like a release, a weight lifting off my shoulders after years of suffocating under the guise of a failing marriage. The moment Dr. Reed's hand covered mine, something deep inside me shifted. It was a quiet explosion, not marked by fireworks, but by the undeniable realization that I had already passed the point of no return. I left his office that evening in a daze, my mind racing with a mix of fear and exhilaration. The rain was falling harder now, soaking through my coat as I hurried to my car. I kept telling myself it was nothing, a fleeting moment, a mistake that could be forgotten. But deep down, I knew better. That touch had awakened something I couldn't ignore. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that nothing had changed. I went about my usual routine, work, errands, therapy sessions with my husband, but everything felt different. The world seemed sharper, more vivid, as though I had been living in grayscale until now. And through it all, I couldn't stop thinking about Dr. Reed. At first, I avoided him. During our next session, I kept my answers short, avoiding eye contact whenever possible. My husband didn't seem to notice. He was too busy airing his grievances and deflecting blame. But I could feel Dr. Reed's gaze on me, steady and searching, as though he was waiting for me to say something. When the session ended, I left quickly, mumbling a vague excuse about being late for an appointment. That evening, I lay awake in bed staring at the ceiling. My husband was already asleep beside me, his soft snores filling the room. I felt a wave of guilt wash over me, not for what had happened, but for what I wanted to happen. I was torn between the life I had built and the life I was beginning to imagine, one where I wasn't just a wife or a caretaker, but a woman who felt seen and desired. The turning point came during an individual session. My husband had canceled at the last minute, again, leaving me alone with Dr. Reed. I told myself I could handle it, that I could keep things professional. But the moment I walked into his office and saw the way he looked at me, all my resolve crumbled. He didn't say anything at first, just gestured for me to sit. I hesitated, unsure of where to begin. The room felt smaller, more intimate, and the silence between us was deafening. "I've noticed you've been quieter lately," he said finally, his voice careful. "Is everything okay?" I nodded, though the truth was written all over my face. "I'm fine," I said, but my voice wavered. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on his knees. "You don't have to do this alone," he said gently. "Whatever you're feeling, it's okay to talk about it." The words were like a dam breaking. Before I knew it, I was pouring out everything, the loneliness, the frustration, the guilt, and the longing I couldn't shake. I tried to be vague, to dance around the truth, but he saw right through me. "You ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. like you're stuck in a role you didn't choose. His expression softened, and for a moment, I thought he might reach for me. But instead, he spoke in that steady, soothing voice that had become my lifeline. "I think we all feel that way sometimes," he said. "The important thing is figuring out what you want and giving yourself permission to want it." The words hit me like a thunderclap. I looked at him, searching his face for any sign of judgment, but there was none. Instead, I saw understanding, compassion, and something else. Something that made my heart race. The first kiss was tentative, almost accidental. It happened one evening after another late session when the rest of the building was empty. I was standing by the door, my hand on the knob, when he called my name. "Wait," he said, his voice soft but urgent. I turned, my heart pounding. He was standing just a few feet away, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was heavy, charged with the weight of everything unsaid. "I can't keep pretending this isn't happening," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I felt a lump rise in my throat. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean," he said, stepping closer. "This, whatever this is, between us, I can't ignore it anymore." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself leaning toward him as though drawn by an invisible force. And then, before I could stop myself, I kissed him. The kiss was soft at first, tentative and unsure, but it quickly deepened. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer as my fingers tangled in his hair. It was like nothing I had ever felt before. A rush of emotion so intense it left me breathless. For a moment, the world fell away, leaving only the two of us in that small, quiet office. When we finally pulled apart, I felt a mix of exhilaration and terror. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Don't be," he said, his gaze steady. "I've wanted this for a long time." From that moment on, everything changed. The affair unfolded slowly, cautiously, as though we were both testing the limits of what we could get away with. At first, it was just stolen moments, a lingering touch, a quiet conversation, a kiss shared in the shadows. But as the weeks went on, the boundaries between us began to blur. We were careful, always careful. We never met outside the office, never exchanged texts or calls that could be traced, but the intensity of our connection made it harder and harder to keep our feelings hidden. Every glance, every touch, every whispered word felt like a secret we couldn't contain. At home, I felt like I was living a double life. My husband remained oblivious, too wrapped up in his own world to notice the changes in me. I told myself I was doing this for my happiness, that I deserved to feel alive again. But the guilt lingered, a constant shadow that I couldn't escape. The first time we were truly alone together outside the confines of the office was both thrilling and terrifying. He had suggested meeting at a secluded park, a place where we wouldn't risk running into anyone we knew. I agreed, though my heart was racing the entire drive there. When I arrived, he was already waiting, leaning against his car with a look of quiet anticipation. He smiled when he saw me, and for a moment all my doubts melted away. "You came," he said simply. "I couldn't stay away," I admitted. The evening was a blur of stolen kisses, quiet laughter, and whispered confessions. It felt like stepping into a dream, a world where nothing else existed but the two of us. But as the sun began to set, reality crept back in, bringing with it the weight of what we were doing. As I drove home that night, I felt a mix of emotions: joy, guilt, fear, and longing that I couldn't shake. I knew what we were doing was dangerous, that it could all come crashing down at any moment, but I couldn't stop. I didn't want to. Every secret meeting, every stolen kiss, every moment spent in Dr. Reed's arms pulled me deeper into a world I both craved and feared. The affair had taken on a life of its own, growing into something neither of us could fully control. At first, it was exhilarating, the risk, the secrecy, the way he made me feel alive again. It was intoxicating. But as the weeks turned into months, that exhilaration was laced with a growing sense of paranoia. Our meetings became more frequent, more intense. We found ways to carve out time for each other, slipping away from our respective lives to create a world of our own. Sometimes it was his office after hours, the blinds drawn and the door locked. Other times it was a secluded corner of the park where we could sit close and talk without fear of being overheard. Each encounter left me breathless and wanting more. But with each moment we shared, the stakes grew higher. At home, I was walking a tightrope, trying to maintain the illusion of normalcy while hiding the truth from my husband. He seemed oblivious, his focus still on work and his own frustrations. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was beginning to notice the changes in me, the way I smiled more often, the way I seemed lighter, freer. "Is there something you're not telling me?" he asked one evening as we sat in front of the television. His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp, probing. I froze, my heart racing. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. He shrugged, his gaze lingering on me. "I don't know. You've been different lately. Happier, I guess." I forced a laugh, brushing off his comment. "Maybe therapy's actually working," I said, trying to inject some humor into my voice. He didn't respond, but his expression remained thoughtful. I quickly changed the subject, steering the conversation away from dangerous territory. The paranoia wasn't just at home. Every time Dr. Reed and I were together, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the room for anyone who might recognize us. The fear of being caught was ever present, a shadow that loomed over even our most intimate moments. One evening, as we sat in his car in a quiet parking lot, I voiced my concerns. "What if someone finds out?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached over, taking my hand in his. "No one will," he said firmly. "We're careful." "But what if we're not careful enough?" I pressed, my anxiety bubbling to the surface. "What if my husband finds out? What if—" Boom. He cut me off with a kiss, silencing my fears with the warmth of his lips. "We'll be okay," he murmured against my mouth. "I promise." For a moment, I let myself believe him, but as I drove home that night, the doubt crept back in, gnawing at the edges of my happiness. The near miss came on a Wednesday afternoon. I had taken the day off work, using the excuse of running errands to sneak away for a few hours with Dr. Reed. We had decided to meet at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, a place we thought would be safe. Everything was fine at first. We sat at a corner table, our heads close, as we talked in hushed tones. He reached across the table to take my hand, his thumb brushing lightly against my skin. I felt a thrill run through me, the rest of the world fading away. But then I heard a voice behind me, a voice I recognized all too well. My heart stopped as I turned to see one of my husband's co-workers standing just a few feet away, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. He said, his tone cautious. "Aren't you?" I forced a smile, cutting him off before he could say my name. "Oh, hi, just grabbing coffee with a friend," I said quickly, gesturing to Dr. Reed. The man's gaze flicked between us, suspicion clear on his face. "Right," he said slowly. "Well, tell your husband I said hello." "I will," I replied, my voice strained. "Good to see you." As he walked away, I turned back to Dr. Reed, my hands trembling. "This is getting too risky," I whispered, my voice filled with panic. He reached across the table, his hand steadying mine. "It was just a coincidence," he said calmly. "We'll be more careful." But I couldn't shake the feeling that our luck was running out. At home, my husband's suspicions continued to grow. He started asking more questions, his tone increasingly sharp. "Where were you this afternoon?" he asked one evening as I prepared dinner. "Just running errands," I replied, keeping my voice casual. "For 4 hours?" he pressed, his eyes narrowing. "Ah," I shrugged, avoiding his gaze. Traffic was terrible. He didn't respond, but the tension in the room was palpable. I could feel his eyes on me, watching my every move. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, I felt the weight of my double life pressing down on me. The fear of being caught was suffocating, but the thought of giving up Dr. Reed was unbearable. I was trapped in a web of my own making, and I couldn't see a way out. Despite the growing paranoia, the affair continued to intensify. Each stolen moment felt more urgent, more desperate, as though we were racing against an invisible clock. The passion between us was all-consuming, leaving little room for rational thought. When we were together, nothing else mattered. But when we were apart, the reality of our situation came crashing down. Dr. Reed tried to reassure me, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to my spiraling anxiety. "We'll figure this out," he said one evening as we sat in his office after hours. "You just need to trust me." "I do trust you," I said, my voice trembling. "But it's not sustainable. Something has to give." He nodded, his expression serious. "I know, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it." The breaking point came one evening when my husband confronted me directly. He had found something, an email, a receipt, or perhaps just a small detail I had overlooked. Whatever it was, it had been enough to confirm his suspicions. "Who is he?" he demanded, his voice shaking with anger. I froze, my mind racing. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to feign ignorance. "Don't play dumb," he snapped. "I know there's someone else." And the words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The walls I had so carefully built were crumbling around me, and I could feel the life I had been clinging to slipping through my fingers. The moment my husband uttered those words, "I know there's someone else," time seemed to stop. My heart pounded in my chest, the truth teetering on the edge of my tongue. For weeks, I had been living in fear of this confrontation, rehearsing what I might say if it ever came to this. But now that it was here, I was at a loss. I turned to face him, my mind racing. "What are you talking about?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He held up his phone, his hand trembling with anger. "This," he said, his voice thick with rage. On the screen was a photo, blurry but unmistakable. It was of me and Dr. Reed at the cafe, our heads close together, his hand lightly brushing mine. My blood ran cold. Someone had taken the photo and sent it to him. It must have been his coworker, the man who had seen us that day. My chest tightened as I realized there was no talking my way out of this. "Is this what you've been doing while I'm at work?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Sneaking around behind my back? With your therapist, no less?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The room felt like it was spinning, the walls closing in around me. Finally, I forced myself to speak. "It's not what it looks like," I said, though even I didn't believe the lie. "Don't insult my intelligence," he snapped. "I've been suspicious for weeks, the late nights, the excuses, the way you've been acting. I just didn't want to believe it." The anger in his voice was laced with something else, hurt. For all his flaws, I knew I had broken something in him that might never be repaired. The confrontation that followed was explosive. He demanded details, his questions relentless and cutting. "How long has this been going on? Did you even try to work on our marriage, or was this your plan all along? Do you love him?" The last question caught me off guard. Love? I hadn't allowed myself to think about it in those terms. What I had with Dr. Reed felt too fragile, too complicated to define. But in that moment, faced with my husband's pain, I realized I couldn't deny the depth of my feelings. I don't know," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You don't know? That's all you have to say?" "I didn't mean for this to happen," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I was unhappy, and I didn't know how to fix it." "And instead of talking to me, you turned to him," he said, his voice cracking. "You let him into our marriage, our lives." The days that followed were a blur of arguments, accusations, and tears. My husband moved into the guest room, leaving an unbearable silence in our bedroom. At work, I went through the motions, unable to focus on anything but the unraveling of my life. And in the evenings, I found myself staring at my phone, torn between calling Dr. Reed and cutting him out of my life completely. When I finally reached out to him, it was with trembling hands and a heart full of uncertainty. "We need to talk," I said, my voice shaking. "Everything's falling apart." He agreed to meet me at his office after hours, and as I walked through the familiar doors, I felt a wave of emotion wash over me. This place, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like the epicenter of my undoing. When Dr. Reed saw me, his expression was a mix of concern and guilt. "I heard," he said softly, gesturing for me to sit. I sank into the chair, unable to meet his eyes. "He knows," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He found out about us." He nodded, his expression grave. I figured it was only a matter of time. The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What are we going to do?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I don't know how to fix this." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "We can't keep going like this," he said finally. "I care about you more than I should, but it's not sustainable." The words felt like a knife to my chest. I had known this was a possibility, that our relationship was built on a fragile foundation, but hearing him say it made the reality impossible to ignore. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice shaking. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored my own. "I'm saying we need to step back, for both our sakes." Leaving his office that night felt like the end of something I hadn't been ready to let go of. I drove aimlessly for hours, the tears blurring my vision as I replayed our conversation in my mind. He was right, of course. What we were doing was unsustainable, reckless, and ultimately doomed. But knowing that didn't make it any easier. At home, my husband's anger had cooled into a cold, simmering resentment. We avoided each other as much as possible, speaking only when necessary. The house, once filled with the sounds of our lives, now felt like a tomb. One evening, as I sat alone in the kitchen, he appeared in the doorway. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the silence between us heavy and suffocating. "What happens now?" he asked finally, his voice devoid of emotion. I shook my head, unable to meet his gaze. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know how to fix this." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Maybe it's not fixable." The words hung in the air, a painful truth neither of us wanted to acknowledge. He turned and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the weight of my mistakes. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the affair continued to ripple through my life. Word of what had happened spread quickly, fueled by whispers and speculation. Friends who had once been supportive now kept their distance, their judgment clear in their silence. At work, I threw myself into my job, desperate for a distraction, but even there I couldn't escape the consequences of my actions. Every time my phone buzzed with a message or an email, I felt a pang of anxiety, wondering if it was another reminder of the life I had unraveled. As for Dr. Reed, we maintained our distance, both of us knowing that any further contact would only make things worse. But even as I tried to move on, I couldn't shake the memories of our time together, the way he made me feel, the way he saw me in a way no one else ever had. One day, as I sat alone in a quiet corner of the park, I thought about what he had said, that we couldn't keep going like this. He was right, of course, but as I looked out at the world around me, I couldn't help but wonder if there was a way to start over, to build something new out of the ashes of what I had destroyed. But for now, all I could do was wait and see where life would take me next. It's a strange feeling to stand in the aftermath of your own destruction, looking at the ruins and trying to piece together what went wrong. That was my reality in the weeks after my affair with Dr. Reed came to light. The moments that once felt exhilarating, those stolen glances, the secret rendezvous, now felt like dark shadows, reminders of the lies I had built my life upon. What I had hoped would remain hidden, buried in the corners of my heart, had come crashing down, and with it, everything I had once known. My husband Jacob had been the first to discover the truth. I never expected it to happen like this. I had carefully woven my lies, each one feeding into the other, always one step ahead, or so I thought. But I had underestimated the power of doubt, the power of a husband's suspicion. It was a Thursday evening when it happened. I had been late coming home from work, something that had become increasingly frequent in the past few months. The late nights, spent working late, had been a convenient excuse to meet Dr. Reed. But this particular night, I had stayed longer than usual. I was exhausted, but I didn't dare call it quits with him. Dr. Reed had promised that we would figure things out. The more time we spent together, the more tangled our feelings became. When I walked through the door that evening, Jacob was sitting at the kitchen table. His back was to me, but I could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. My heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. I set my keys on the counter and started to say something, but the words stuck in my throat. He turned around slowly, his eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice low and strained. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the judgment in his tone. I opened my mouth to speak, to tell him that I had been working late, but for some reason I couldn't lie this time. The words felt too hollow, too false. Sarah. Anne. He didn't raise his voice, but there was a sharpness in it that made my stomach churn. I know about you and him. The world tilted beneath me. I froze, the blood draining from my face. My knees wobbled and I gripped the edge of the counter for support. Jacob, I began, but the words felt like they were caught in my throat. He didn't wait for me to explain. I know about Dr. Reed, he said, his voice trembling. I found your phone, the messages, the photos, the text you sent him, the things you said. I can't believe I didn't see it before. I wanted to deny it, to scream that it wasn't true, that he had misunderstood, but I knew it wouldn't work. The evidence was right there in front of him, my betrayal written in black and white. I should have known, Jacob continued, his voice breaking. You've been so distant lately, so cold. I've been asking myself what happened, what I did wrong, but I never thought it was this. I never thought it would be you. The anger in his voice was hard to listen to, but it was nothing compared to the deep, profound sadness in his eyes. That was what tore me apart. I had always thought I could hide it, that I could keep him from knowing. But now here I was, face to face with the truth and the consequences. I'm so sorry, I whispered, my voice shaking. I never meant for this to happen. I didn't plan for any of this. He shook his head, standing up slowly. You didn't plan for it? Really? Then what was it, Sarah? What was all of this? You've been lying to me, to yourself, for months. And for what? For a fling with a man who could never love you the way I did? The words hit me like a punch to the gut. He was right. Dr. Reed had never promised me anything. It had been an affair built on lies and desire, not love. And now, everything I had built, my marriage, my life, was falling apart. Jacob, please, I begged, my voice desperate. Please don't leave. I'll do anything. I'll end it with him. I'll go to therapy. I'll fix it, I swear. But his face was already hardening, his eyes narrowing. You think it's that easy? You think you can just fix this with a few words? No, Sarah, I'm done. I can't keep living like this, wondering if you're lying to me every time you leave the house. I deserve better. And just like that, he walked out. He didn't even wait for me to respond. He didn't need to. The decision had already been made. And in that moment, I realized that no apology would ever be enough. The next few days were a blur. Jacob moved out, staying with his brother, and the silence in the apartment was suffocating. I sat in the same spot for hours, staring at the empty spaces we once filled together. There was no anger left in me, just an aching emptiness that consumed me, like a black hole pulling everything in. It wasn't just my marriage that had fallen apart. The betrayal had spread to every corner of my life. Dr. Reed and I tried to talk, but it felt hollow. The chemistry between us, once so electric, had fizzled out. There was nothing left to salvage between us, and we both knew it. He told me he needed space to figure things out, that he couldn't be there for me in the way I needed, and that was the end of it. As the days passed, I began to face the enormity of what I had done. The shame, the guilt, they were suffocating, and yet I couldn't escape them. I had hurt the one person who had loved me unconditionally. Jacob had been patient, kind, and committed, and I had thrown it all away for a fleeting, selfish moment of passion. And for what? One afternoon, I sat down and wrote him a letter. It wasn't an apology. I had already offered countless apologies. Instead, it was an acknowledgement. I wrote about my mistakes, my regrets, and how deeply sorry I was for causing him pain. But it wasn't just about him. I needed to understand why I had done it, why I had allowed myself to fall into something that I knew would destroy everything. Writing helped me untangle the mess of emotions inside me, even if I didn't have all the answers. I tried to get back to some semblance of normalcy, returning to work and resuming my daily routines, but nothing felt the same. My coworkers looked at me differently, their whispers following me wherever I went. I had become the office pariah, the one who had destroyed her own life and let everyone see it. The guilt gnawed at me. How could I show my face, knowing that everyone knew the truth? Rachel was the only one who still supported me, though even she seemed unsure of how to approach me. She knew about the affair, of course, but now our conversations were tinged with a sense of distance. It wasn't that she judged me, it was just that the situation was so complicated. I didn't blame her for needing space. I needed space too. A week later, I received a call from Jacob. It was the first time I'd heard from him since he left. My heart raced, and I hesitated for a moment before picking up. Sarah. His voice was quieter than usual. I've been thinking a lot about everything, and I don't know what's next. The ache in his voice made me want to reach through the phone and hold him, but I didn't know how. I wasn't sure if I had the right to. I understand, I said softly. I don't expect anything from you, Jacob. I've ruined everything. There was a long pause on the other end. Then he sighed deeply. I don't know what's next either. But I think we need to talk. About what happened. About us. It wasn't a promise and it wasn't a resolution, but it was something. An opening. A chance for reconciliation, however unlikely it seemed. I didn't know if Jacob could forgive me, if I could ever forgive myself, but at least for the moment, we were talking, and that, for now, was enough. After the call with Jacob, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. It wasn't the blinding, naive hope I had clung to during the affair, the hope that everything would magically work out. This was quieter, more fragile. A hesitant belief that, despite everything I had destroyed, I might still find a way to rebuild. Not the same life, but something new. Jacob and I met at a park near his brother's house the following weekend. I arrived early, sitting on a bench overlooking a pond. The water was still, mirroring the cloudy sky above, and I felt the same way, suspended, uncertain, waiting for something to break the surface. When Jacob arrived, I stood unsure of whether to greet him with a hug or keep my distance. He solved the problem for me by nodding and sitting down, gesturing for me to do the same. His expression was guarded, his jaw tight, but there was no outright anger in his eyes. That felt like progress. For a while we sat in silence. I wanted to fill the quiet with words, to apologize again, to explain myself, but I held back, sensing that he needed to speak first. Finally, he exhaled sharply, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I don't know where to start, he admitted, his voice low. I've spent weeks trying to make sense of this, but I just I don't understand. Why him? Why this?" His words were raw, and I felt the weight of his pain like a physical blow. "I don't know if I can give you an answer that will make sense," I said quietly, "but I'll try." I took a deep breath, organizing my thoughts. I wasn't happy, Jacob. I felt invisible, like I was just going through the motions, doing what I was supposed to do, but never really being seen. And when I started therapy, Dr. Reed, he saw me. He listened in a way I hadn't felt in years. Jacob flinched, and I immediately regretted saying his name. "That doesn't excuse what I did," I added quickly. "Nothing can. I made a selfish, reckless choice, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But it wasn't about you. It was about me, about the things I was too scared to confront." He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the pond. "I've been asking myself if I failed you," he said after a moment. "If there was something I should have done differently." "No," I said firmly, "this wasn't your fault. You were a good husband, Jacob. I was the one who couldn't handle my own feelings, who didn't know how to ask for what I needed." His shoulders sagged slightly, as if the weight he'd been carrying had lightened, if only a little. "I appreciate you saying that," he said, "but it doesn't change what happened." "I know," I replied, "and I don't expect forgiveness. I wanted to tell you the truth." We talked for a long time after that, untangling the threads of our marriage and the choices that had led us to this point. It wasn't easy. There were tears, raised voices, moments of painful silence, but it felt necessary. By the time the sun began to set, I felt a small sense of closure. We weren't magically fixed, but we had taken the first step toward understanding. After that meeting, Jacob and I spoke occasionally, but it was clear that reconciliation wasn't on the table. He was moving on, and I needed to do the same. For the first time in years, I was faced with the prospect of building a life that was entirely my own. It was daunting, but it was also freeing. I started with small, tangible goals: decorating my apartment, reconnecting with friends, and focusing on my career. Work was still challenging. There were whispers and judgment from colleagues who knew about the affair, but I threw myself into my projects, determined to prove that I could rise above the scandal. One afternoon, my manager called me into her office. I braced myself for another lecture about professionalism, but to my surprise, her tone was warm. "I've noticed a change in you lately," she said. "You seem more focused, more grounded. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." Her words felt like validation, a reminder that I wasn't defined by my mistakes. I thanked her and left her office with a renewed sense of purpose. Dr. Reed was a more complicated matter. I hadn't spoken to him since we agreed to end things, and the silence between us felt like a wound that refused to heal. I thought about him often, wondering if he missed me, if he regretted what had happened. But I knew that reaching out would only reopen old wounds. One evening, as I was scrolling through my phone, I came across his number. My finger hovered over the call button, my heart pounding. I wanted so badly to hear his voice, to feel the connection we once shared. But instead, I deleted his contact information. It was a small act, but it felt like a step toward letting go. Therapy became a lifeline for me, though this time I chose a different therapist, someone completely removed from my past mistakes. Her name was Linda, and she had a calm, no-nonsense demeanor that I found comforting. In our sessions, we delved into the patterns and insecurities that had led to my affair, unraveling the layers of guilt and self-doubt that I had carried for so long. It sounds like you spent a lot of your life trying to meet other people's expectations, Linda said during one session. But what about your own? What do you want for yourself? The question caught me off guard. For so long, I had defined myself by my roles: wife, lover, caretaker. I had never taken the time to consider what I truly wanted. I don't know, I admitted, but I think I'd like to find out. As the months passed, I began to feel more like myself, or perhaps like someone I was meeting for the first time. I started going to yoga classes, something I had always wanted to try but never made time for. I joined a book club, reconnecting with my love of literature, and I started journaling again, using the blank pages to explore my thoughts and dreams. One day, as I was flipping through my journal, I came across a passage I had written during the early days of the affair. For the first time in years, I feel alive, but at what cost? The words felt like a time capsule, a snapshot of the person I had been. I didn't recognize her anymore. The woman I was becoming didn't need an affair or validation from someone else to feel alive. She was learning to find that within herself. Rachel remained a constant presence in my life, her friendship a source of strength during my lowest moments. We talked often, about everything and nothing, and she never shied away from calling me out when I needed it. "You've come a long way," she said one evening as we sat on my balcony, sipping wine and watching the city lights. "I'm proud of you." Her words brought tears to my eyes. "Thank you," I said, "for sticking with me. I don't know what I would have done without you." "You're stronger than you think," she replied, "but I'll always be here if you need me." By the time the 1-year anniversary of the affair rolled around, I felt like a different person. I still carried the scars of my mistakes, but they no longer defined me. I had learned to forgive myself, to accept that I couldn't change the past, but could choose how to move forward. On the anniversary itself, I spent the day alone, reflecting on everything that had happened. I thought about Jacob and Dr. Reed, about the choices that had led me to this point, and about the person I was becoming. I wrote a letter to myself, detailing my regrets and my hopes for the future. Then I folded it and tucked it away in a drawer, a reminder of how far I had come. In the end, the affair had been both a destruction and a rebirth. It had forced me to confront the parts of myself I had been avoiding for so long, to take ownership of my flaws and my desires. And while I couldn't undo the damage I had caused, I had found a way to move forward with honesty and integrity. As I stood on my balcony that evening, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, I felt a sense of peace. My life wasn't perfect, and the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time I felt like I was standing on solid ground, a foundation I could build on, one step at a time.